Thank you for watching Conscious Consumer Network. The live stream broadcast is free to view. You can pause and rewind live broadcasts to catch up, or view shows at a later date by accessing our free archives of all shows. Check out our broadcast guide to see what's on. You can show your support by donating to our network support fund. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, or subscribe to the monthly newsletter for updates. We thank you for supporting free and independent media.
This is For the Love of Learning, Voices of the Alternative Education Movement. Be inspired by the voices of visionaries, changemakers, and ordinary, extraordinary people who do what they do, all for the love of learning.
This is For the Love of Learning, Voices of the Alternative Education Movement. I'm Lainey Liberty, and this is episode number 111. Tonight, we're going to talk about managing mobility and third culture kids. This is our second show on the topic, so we urge you to check out the For the Love of Learning archives and look for episode number 102 to support this episode. No generation before now has had so many of its members simultaneously living in, between, and among countless cultural worlds as is happening today. What is involved to manage this sort of mobility? What happens when the mobility is not managed? And what are some of the challenges to actually manage the mobility for the children and their families? And how do these challenges affect a TCK's development and lives? We've got a lot to explore and a wonderful panel to explore these issues with, so we're going to jump right in. I'm going to first read each of our panelists' bios, but I wanted to remind our audience that you can find out more about each of our participants on tonight's show on the show notes page located at fortheloveoflearningshow.com, and look for the show notes page for episode number 111. There you will find more information about each of our panelists and links to their projects and websites. So our first panelist tonight, I'd like to introduce you to Jen. Jen spent her early years in a middle-class Indiana high school in the ghetto, college years in the Ivy League, and young adult years in the high-rolling worlds of Northern California tech startups and real estate investing. Jen is also an internationally known conceptual artist and has written multiple books and a sci-fi screenplay. Such a variety of experiences coupled with a frequent work travel, a European backpacking adventure, and a fierce independent streak pretty much guaranteed that education would be based on compassion, creativity, interest, entrepreneurship, and global community building. Jen and her family became unintentional world schoolers in 2005 when they moved to Tahoe for the winter. When they returned, They started a consulting company with the eventual goal of becoming international nomads. In 2007, they left their home in Northern California and spent several years living in multiple um, U.S. cities for 6 to 18 months each. They had planned to begin their world schooling internationally, and two families were diagnosed with complex health issues. Rather than giving up traveling altogether, the family sold 99% of their stuff and moved into a vintage RV and began exploring the U.S. and Canada. In 2016, as everyone's health improved, the family flew abroad and lived briefly in Italy, Greece, Turkey, England, Wales, Ireland, and Canada. And Jen also became an admin for the World Schoolers Facebook group. In 2017, they will split their time between the RV and international trips, including Central and South America, Asia, and Montreal. So welcome to tonight's show, Jen.
Thank you. Always a pleasure to be here. Looking forward to hearing from you and the other panelists as well.
I am too. Thank you for being here with us tonight. Next, I'd like to introduce you to Jane. Jane is a youth intercultural transition specialist and culturally responsive educator driven to improve emotional, social, and educational outcomes for cross-cultural students and their families. Her experience as an educator of 24 years in both international and local schools, a parent of two cross-cultural children, and a child of a domestically mobile family and now a repatriate to Australia inform her work. She has seen and understands the impact of moving across cultures upon individuals. Founder of Globally Grounded, Jean is dedicated to supporting students crossing cultures, their families, and those who educate them as they navigate through the triumphs and challenges associated with cross-cultural, domestic, and international transitions. This may be from one country to another, or one state to another, or one city to another, or from one subculture to another, such as indigenous to non-indigenous, rural to urban, family home to boarding school, and vice versa. Jane consults to international and local schools, families, and students crossing cultures, developing their understanding of the impact of cross-cultural mobility, designing programs and implementing support mechanisms to enhance learning and life. Welcome to tonight's panel, Jane. We're so happy to have you back.
Thank you, Lainey. I'm excited to be back and so looking forward to learning from everyone else on this panel as well as contributing. Thank you.
You're so very welcome. And finally, I'd like to introduce you to our final panelist, Ava. Ava is a freelance art director with a unique skill set that includes strategic planning, project management. She has worked in Melbourne, Tokyo, Dubai with brands including Apple, FC Barcelona, Libra, Netball, Australia, Parks, Victoria, and Bing, Australia. Ava is passionate about the positive power of cultural diversity and founded TCK Town last year as a result. TCK Town is a digital journal about cross-culturalism, which Ava runs as the editor-in-chief. Ava leads a core team of 8 who work remotely from Australia, Pakistan, Japan, and the Philippines to produce articles each week on tcktown.com and create content across Facebook, Instagram, and a weekly newsletter. TCK Town's articles are honest, insightful, and embrace vulnerability in a refreshing and exciting way. So welcome, Ava, and we're going to start the conversation with you.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much for having me today, Lainey. It's awesome to be here.
You're so very welcome. So my assumption is you are a TCK yourself, and that probably inspired you for TCK Town. Can you talk a little bit about your life and what led you to start this project?
Sure. I think on kind of a micro scale. I didn't really quite understand that I was a TCK till I think much later on, even though I had grown up in Dubai. And I think living in Dubai, everyone is a third culture kid. But I think because I was surrounded by them, I had no idea what we were and how we were maybe different to real locals. I think I only realized it when I moved to Tokyo, and I lived in a share house where they had a rule in terms of boarding where half of the people who lived in the house were locals and the other half were people who were international. And I think living in that environment, when I started to meet other TCKs, I realized, oh my God, okay, now all the things that I thought was weird about myself is actually part of this group of people from all over the world. And it's actually something that all of us have in common, living in different places, and being interested in local cultures and wanting to be a part of that. And TCK Town came about after I moved away from Tokyo and moved back to Melbourne. And I was keeping in touch with one of my TCK friends. And he's a writer at TCK Town. His name's Paul. His articles are published with us every month. And he puts this really gorgeous email together for all his other friends all across the world. And he just writes stories about everyday occurrences, but because he's a TCK, he sees a simple thing across many different cultural perspectives. So posting a letter for him will remind him about the postman in Spain when he was a child. And then he'll talk about the technicalities of parcels in Japan and everything that you have to sign before you can send something off, and what it feels like to receive a letter in Alaska when he used to live there. And these stories were so simple, but they were so gorgeous, and I loved receiving them. That I thought, why don't the two of us work together and put a magazine together? If we really like learning about each other's cultural backgrounds and stories, even about simple things, surely other TCKs must feel the same. And I think that's what makes TCK so special as well, is that we constantly want to learn. So we recruited other writers, and we've been going strong for about a year now. And I think, that's sort of in a small way, without like going through my whole story of where I moved around. That's kind of how my TCK background sort of led to tcktown.com.
So before we move on, I want to talk about, okay, so you're talking about living in this boarding house with all these other internationals, but the assumption I got was you were an adult or a young adult when you were doing this, and the term TCK includes, the K represents the word kids. Is this a term that applies to people of all ages, or go ahead.
Oh, yeah, sure. I mean, yes, honestly, yes. Like, I would say I am a TCK in the traditional sense, because I was born in Sri Lanka and we moved before I was a year or 2 years old, and I've been moving ever since. So I would say, although I'm a third culture kid, I think, and this is what we're talking about within our team at the moment, the term is a little limiting, because some of our writers became third cultured when they were adults, when they moved for work for the first time, or they moved after they were 18 and 21 after university, and they wanted to travel before they settled down. So I did relate to the term third culture kid, but as an editor who's working with people across so many backgrounds, I think, that K is a little unfortunate. And we're actually trying to rename our magazine at the moment and try and come up with a term that fits people who've experienced this kind of cultural shift at any stage in their life. And I think even going back to Jane's background, I think it also relates to domestic shifts as well. You don't have to shift from different countries to experience a cultural change. I think even like moving from the city to a country or even moving to within different parts of a state, you still have this like similar cultural challenges that you have to overcome. So hopefully that answers your question. So yeah, the K is there, worked for me, but I don't think it works for everyone.
Yeah, no, thank you. And you know, again, I didn't expect for you to answer, you know, based on the entire world, you know, and the usage of the term. But the funny thing is I'm a TCP, third culture parent, because you know, and I actually don't like the way that sounds. TCP doesn't sound nice, but we identify with the movement because it applies to our lives, although the terminology doesn't exactly describe who we are. But I think that's wonderful, and thank you for sharing in this intro. It was a great way to start the show. And actually, why don't we move over to Jen, because Jen, you also talked about in your bio how you moved around in your earlier years, but then you became an international third culture parent as well to third culture kids. And so we'll talk to you a little bit about your identity from that perspective before we go to Jane.
Okay, well, my early upbringing was extremely stable, the stereotypical, we didn't have a white picket fence, but, you know, it might as well have in suburbia in the American Midwest. Very homogenous, you know, just public, you know, what you would imagine. You get up, you have your sack lunch, you go to the local school, that sort of thing. And I had that stable household up until about age 12. But what's interesting is, even though I was in that, you know, stable one household, which so many families think, oh, that's the way, you know, it's got to be that stable way. I did not like it at all. I very early on knew, you know, and there are many beautiful things about that community, but it was very clear to me that it was not my community. So even though I lived in only one home up until about age 12, I clearly knew that I would not always, as soon as possible, I wanted to be moving as much as possible. So my parents divorced and my mom wanted to go to law school in Indianapolis. And as a single mom, you know, the way to take care of your kids, work full time and school full time, is to have everything be in a 3 square mile radius, which is what she did. She was one of the first people to have a work at home business, you know, before the internet, but through technology. And so we went from, you know, a very homogenous sort of upper middle class neighborhood in suburbia to living, you know, ground zero in inner city Indianapolis. It was a wide, I loved it. It was an expanding experience. And it just reinforced that idea that there are so many different people living these different lives, and that I wanted to experience as many of them as I could. At the same time, that particular community wasn't necessarily one I was interested in staying in either. So at that time, school was my ticket out. So I just worked like crazy and started college early, and then moved to upstate New York for Cornell University. So I kind of went from, you know, homogenous suburbia to hardcore inner city war zone, really, with a lot of wonderful people that were trapped in that war zone. And then toward academia, to the highest levels of wealthy, you know, Northeastern families and international families. So that was my childhood. And even though we weren't moving countries, there was such an economic diversity and cultural diversity along the financial spectrum that I might as well have moved to third world countries and back. And then, you know, and then the high tech boom started, and I always knew California was where I wanted to live. And that's it. The universe just manifested. I met my husband. He was from California. High tech was happening in California. I'm an entrepreneur, and that was the hub of all the exciting technology entrepreneur. So that's where we headed. And From there, we thought we would stay there forever. We loved it there. And then eventually, as dreams do, that dream changed as well. And then we went into, traveling more as adults and with our own children.
So you were responsible for being a third culture parent. What kind of preparation or support that was outside of what you would imagine just being like an American-centric preparation that was necessary for you on your journey?
That's a great question. So before kids, I had backpacked Europe. And I also am an entrepreneur, particularly sales and marketing. And so I traveled all over the U.S. For work. I was always on a plane racking up flyer miles. So I loved flying. I guess I was world schooling myself just through that. Kansas City, sure, send me to Kansas City. I mean, anywhere. I didn't care where you sent me. I just loved getting on a plane. I loved walking through the airports. I loved waiting in line at the airports. I loved everything about the process of traveling. I didn't care where we were going. So I had traveled quite a lot like that. And then I had backpacked. And then I had traveled for work internationally as well. But aside from that, I really had zero support. At that point, I don't even think Facebook existed. We weren't aware of the broader communities that were out there that were doing this. There wasn't as much mobility back then, I don't think. This was in the 90s. And, so it just didn't quite exist. We weren't thinking that we were even going to homeschool our kids, let alone world school our kids. So we didn't have kids until I had a stepson who was traditionally, who lived with us, who was raised extremely traditionally in the school system. So it really wasn't until he graduated high school and then we had a shift in careers that it became clear life could take a different path. There was he decided to go to college in Montreal. So there was no reason even for us to be tied to the Bay Area anymore. And that's, like I said, we were unintentional world schoolers. We really didn't mean to do this. What happened is my husband got a buyout package at his work. His company had kept getting acquired until it was up at a big corporation, and he didn't want to be there. And they had too many people there. And so they were offering packages, and we took it, and we had no idea what we were going to do. So we just said, let's take 6 months and just ski. And we did. We went up to Tahoe and we connected with a couple of other families. And that was one of the best experiences still of our world schooling, was just being in a home with multiple families and the women and fathers sharing all the responsibilities of the cooking and the cleaning, and an instant community. But it still didn't really, the light bulb didn't go off. We just thought, well, this has been a great 6 months. And then we went back home and thought we would have to adult, and but we didn't like that idea very much. So we decided, we were used to spending time together, and our kids were young, and we had already had one bird fly the nest, and we knew that it happened fast, and corporate careers did not allow us as much time with our oldest as we would have liked. So, here we were on round 2 with these, I think at that age they were 2 and 4. So we knew, okay, we don't want to make that mistake again. Let's find a career that provides us flexibility. And and then that's kind of the start. I don't know if you want me to keep talking about what we've done since then, but that was the start of how so not a lot of support. In fact, family support, the opposite of support. They thought we were bonkers, and so it really was us just kind of bumbling into it, I would say.
Yeah, and actually I think the whole concept about support is something that we're going to talk about a little bit later on. But before we do, I want to jump on over to Jane. Jane, you're coming at it from the perspective of being a third culture parent also, but also working with this community, working with those that are in the middle of their transitional phases as well. And I'd like for you to talk a little bit about why you took on this role, and what keeps you going in this role? What is it that keeps you engaged and involved, because you've repatriated?
Yes, that's right, Lainey. I have repatriated. Well, my journey is in a way not dissimilar to Jen's, and it needs to be told because it helps to explain why I am where I am right now. I grew up also quite an idyllic childhood for the first 11 years on a farm in the middle of New South Wales. It was about 3.5 hours to the nearest capital city. I used to travel 25 miles on the bus to school every day, would leave in the dark, come home in the dark, but our whole life revolved around our farm, and it was just amazing. And then in the early 1980s, it was predicted that Australia would have its worst ever drought, and my dad decided to sell our farm and move to Sydney. Actually, there were two reasons. The second reason was that I was approaching my last years of elementary school, and that meant that for us there were no suitable secondary schools in the area, and I was going to have to be sent to boarding school. And he is Italian. And so he freaked out at the thought of sending, I'm the eldest of 3 girls, and he freaked out at the thought of sending his 3 girls away to boarding school. So those two reasons were the reasons why we sold our property. But what resulted from that was a number of domestic moves up and down the east coast of Australia, 7 different schools in the end. And in hindsight, at the time, I didn't realise, but in hindsight, I think that that's where my passion for helping children in transition came from, because each one of us in our family of 5 transitioned very differently. I loved going to new schools, meeting new people. I just jumped in, boots and all. My sister, who is 17 months younger than me, was traumatised. She spent the first month of every new school in the counsellor's office refusing, well, firstly, that's once they could actually get her inside the school gate. And she just didn't cope well. However, I keep reminding my mum and dad that their money was well spent with counsellors, because now she is the head of this massive events organisation, and she can walk into any room now and light it up and engage people and connect people. So the challenges of mobility, when they are managed, she's my exhibit A. The challenges of mobility, when they are managed, can actually be springboards for growth, and they don't have to be traumatic. And she has learned so much, and I have learned so much from watching each of our family members. But then, as an adult, I went into education. I'm passionate about education, as you are, Lainey, also, and then we had an opportunity to move to Singapore through my husband's work, and we jumped at it. We thought, this would be such a life-changing experience for our boys. We have 2 boys who at the time were 5 and 8. And so we did that. But the thing is, we thought we'd just go for a year. My husband, it was during the global financial crisis, and my husband was asked to go overseas and organise their business there. Just 12 months was our deal. And 6 years later, we repatriated, somewhat reluctantly, I have to confess. But it was during that time in Singapore I did my Masters of Education and became very passionate about third culture kids, and then that morphed into cross-cultural kids, because I realised that third cultural kids, a bit like Ava was saying before, third culture kids, that definition is not inclusive enough. It's kind of can box people, whereas Ruth Van Renken's definition of cross-cultural kids covers all the different variations of mobility that are current today. And in fact, I was just at a conference recently in The Hague, and that was one of the big discussion topics, was the need to get with the times and really broaden our understanding and broaden our way that we label, for want of a better word, children who are crossing cultures. And some of some of their challenges are the same. A lot of their challenges are the same, actually.
Well, if you're working on redefining and coming up with a better term, do one that includes the parents too, because we have challenges as well.
Yes, actually, I can add to that. At this particular conference that I attended in The Hague, a lady by the name of Marielle Despard introduced a whole new term, which is actually called the third culture family. And she came to that because she's in a situation where she and her husband are from different cultures. They have no home to return to, or they met people along the way who had no intention of repatriating, of returning home. And these people have their own challenges, but also their own lifestyle. So much the same as you, Lainey, and the life that you and Miro live, just, it's moving from one to the next with no place to necessarily call home. So she introduced that term at the Families in Global Transition conference in The Hague and got just huge feedback, and so many people went for the first time, yes, that is me, and we as a family, this is our journey together. That might not have been my childhood as a parent, a parent saying that might not have been my childhood, but as a family, this is our journey. And so it was very inclusive, and she went into quite a lot of detail about the benefits of being a third culture family. So it has begun.
Thank you. That really makes me excited, and I think that's going to be a topic for a new show. I want to continue the conversation with you, Jane, about mobility. We talked in the intro that mobility is part of being a third culture kid or a third culture family for that matter. And the comment really is, because it's such a part of the whole experience, if it's managed, it changes the whole experience, if you will. Can you talk about what managing mobility looks like, and kind of flip over to the other side and give us an example of what happens when you don't manage it or ignore the issues that come up with mobility? And then after you speak, Jane, we'll open it up to the rest of the panel.
Okay, I'd be more than happy to talk about that. Yes, the big difference between managed mobility and unmanaged mobility. So unmanaged mobility is where you just pretty much fly by the seat of your pants. They'll be fine. All kids are resilient. They will be fine. Don't worry about them. And it turns out that we are now seeing in adult third culture kids, and this is where we're really seeing the manifestation of unmanaged mobility, because you said in your introduction that we are now at a place where we have more children moving around the world than ever before. We also understand more than we've ever understood before. There's a few research, not a lot, but there's a little bit of research now which really indicates the impact of unmanaged mobility on learning and on life, but it often doesn't manifest until these third culture kids are adults. They're trying to find their way. Often a lot of them have returned back to home for university and discover that they don't belong there, and they have trouble maintaining relationships because they've moved so many times. They don't know how to interact in long-term relationships, and so they're just two examples of some of the manifestations, just that whole rootlessness of not being able to find a place where they belong. And so that causes a lot of emotional and psychological problems later in life. So we can circumvent all of that by managing mobility. And you asked what does that involve? Well, a number of things, and each family is different. So each family has their own culture that they bring. But I would say to you the two things that need to underpin all managing of mobility, whether it is a family or whether it is from an education perspective, is intentionality and authenticity. Those two things are incredibly important. You need to be intentional in the way you go about moving between cultures. So how do we do that? The biggest one, open communication. I just think having open communication within a family or in an educational context is vital. We all know it, but do we actually do it? We can get so caught up in the logistics of moving that the whole actually being authentic and real and being open in our communication can often get pushed to one side. And so what is involved in that? Welcoming all feelings, the good, the bad and the ugly. I don't know if you guys have seen that movie Inside Out, the Pixar movie a couple of years ago. I just think that is a brilliant movie, and I always ask my kids to watch it because it just goes into all the emotions, or certainly the core emotions, and it's such a great conversation piece. Even teenagers, I make teenagers watch it and we use it as a great way of just valuing all feelings and then helping our kids to come back to that contented place. Yes, all emotions are good, but how then do you work through them in order to come to that place of contentment? That's one of the key things. Another thing is developing an emotional vocabulary. So I think one of the tools that I use is an emotional wheel by Caitlin Robb. You can just Google it and you will find it on the internet. It is a brilliant resource, and I have two. So now my boys are teenagers. They are 17 and on Friday 15, and so I have used this with them to help them, give them the words to be specific about what they're feeling. So rather than just saying, oh, I'm sad, you really start to drill down into, well, why are you sad? And giving them words to help that. And so developing an emotional language is very important. The third thing about open communication, listening, being an active listener. Yes, it's just so important. So that's the first thing. Do you want me to keep going or do you want me to pause? Yep, keep going. Okay. The second thing, you have to say a good goodbye in order to say a good hello. And so that means leaving well in order that when you arrive in the new place, you can enter well. That means saying goodbye to people, to pets, to places, to possessions. And I think that is a really important step in making the most of wherever it is that you are going to next. David Pollock talks about the raft. You might have heard of the raft, which is R stands for reconciliation, A stands for affirmation, F stands for farewells, and T stands for thinking ahead. So reconciliation is all about before you leave, stopping and thinking about if you have any issues with anyone at all and reconciling that. So whether you need to apologise, whether you need to write a letter, whatever it is, in order to make sure that you get on that plane or get in that car and you know that everything is in a good place from where you have. And it's such an important life skill, isn't it, to work through the whole reconciliation process. So that's the first thing. Affirmation is the second thing, and that is sitting down and thinking, and I've done this with my boys, with each of their moves, is sitting down and thinking about all the people who've had a positive impact on them, and who they would like to thank in that particular location, and thinking about how best they could do that. It might be a letter, it might be a drawing. In one case, my youngest son had a friend who they played soccer together, and so he decided that he was going to buy a soccer ball and he was going to write all over the soccer ball. And when he went to that friend's house just before he left, there was that soccer ball in their cabinet with all their crystals, with all their crystal, glasses and all that kind of thing. There was that soccer ball. So it just affirmed to both of them the value of their friendship, and that meant that they could leave knowing, both of them could say goodbye to each other, knowing how valuable they were to each other and how valued they were. So that was really special. That's just one example. The F is farewells, the importance of really marking the moment. And sometimes this is really hard, because sometimes when you have to move from one country to another, it can happen at a time when this is when there's no one around, everyone else is on holidays, and all of a sudden the decision is made that your family has to leave. And so this can be very difficult. But if at all possible, I can see Ava is nodding to this, so she might have a story to tell, but if at all possible, it is important to really mark the occasion. So I am a bit of a party person. So when we were going to be leaving Singapore, I said to my boys, right, so let's organise a party. What do you want? And both of them went, no, I don't want a party. And so, okay, well, how would you like to say goodbye to your friends? How would you like to mark this occasion? And my eldest son, who was 14, nearly 15 at the time, said, I just want to go to the movies with my mates, and then afterwards we'll go to dinner. And well, that's pretty boring. Okay, whatever works for you, that's great. And then my other son wanted, in Singapore, we have the Johor Strait between Singapore and Malaysia, and you can actually go wakeboarding there. It's quite interesting, because on one side you've got Malaysia with just the very rugged coastline. On the Singapore side, there are massive fences with barbed wire around them, and then you can ski or wakeboard in between the two. So that's what he wanted to do with 4 of his closest friends. And so my husband and I had the farewell party. So what I'm saying is that each of us have our own personality, so it's important to say farewell in the way that works for you, and don't put the way that you think farewell should be marked on your kids. So really respect their personality on that. The T is for thinking ahead, thinking about the destination, researching it together, letting your kids have input. Yes, that area looks like it could be really good. Help if they have a particular sport that they're passionate about. Finding if there is a club there or an organisation where they're going to be able to pursue that hobby, or that sport, that ballet, that music, whatever it is. So really thinking ahead. So that's the whole goodbye thing. You want me to keep going? I've got 5 more points. So the other thing is one that is really important, and mums often say to me, I'm so worried about my kids, my third culture kids, because they have no place to call home. And the big thing with third culture kids or cross-cultural kids is that home is not really bricks and mortar. And for us who have grown up in the same house on the same street, that's hard for people to get their heads around, parents to get their heads around. But home is much more about relationships, and it's much more about an emotional place. It's a place where they don't have to explain themselves. So part of that as parents that we can do is to put traditions in place, family rituals which are based around your family values, and objects in your home that are always there. So for example, when we moved a lot around Australia, I knew that when I walked into my parents' house, there was always going to be that particular photo in that particular photo frame would always be somewhere near the front door. There's a photo of all 5 of us, and there were also a number of other photos of us doing the crazy things that we did, riding horses, swimming, whatever it was. It was like a table that had photos on it, and whenever we walked in, we knew, okay, this is our house because those pictures were there. And the other thing, of course, was my mum's cooking was always a big thing. But having those rituals, so whether it's Sunday morning going down and getting your toast and your coffee from the local shop together while you walk the dog, or just those things that make our kids feel secure and that they have a real sense of belonging within the family unit. Another one is finding a mentor, finding a significant other person. Now, that doesn't have to be where you are right now. It could be a grandparent who is back in the home country or home culture. It could be a coach. It could be a youth leader from a faith-based organisation. a variety, it could be a variety of different people, but find someone that your kids can talk to who is not a parent, because it's just very important to have that stopgap measure. I spoke a bit before about thinking ahead and getting your children involved in the decision-making process, whilst they won't actually make the ultimate decision as to whether you move or don't move, or what type of education they have or don't have, although they can. Their opinion needs to be validated and needs to be valued, and that gives them some sense of control in a move where often kids don't have a lot of control when families decide to move to a new country, particularly if it's because of someone's work. So having that ability to be actually able to have some choice or help in the decision making is really important. For us as parents, role modelling, actually role modelling the grief and the loss, and being prepared to, I spoke before about having an emotional vocabulary, just being prepared to say, you know what, today's a really hard day. I am really missing my friends in wherever you've just come from, or I'm really struggling to tap into a friendship group here, or whatever it is, just to be real and to actually work through the grieving process and being prepared to own it and be authentic in that. Gives our kids permission to also acknowledge the grief and the loss from wherever of what they're missing, and it helps then for them to be able to really immerse themselves in the new culture and the new place where they are. The last one I would say to you that is really important in managing mobility is keeping your promises. Don't make a promise you cannot keep. Don't say, we'll only be here for 3 years or we'll only be here for 2 years, because it often doesn't work out like that. It can, the rug can be pulled out from you in a heartbeat, or it can be longer. You just need to invest and immerse yourself in that new culture for the time that you're there. So keep your promises. There you go. Sorry, that was a really long answer to that question.
That was fantastic, Jane. It gives me so many thoughts. I love it when people come at it from an academic point of view and an experiential point of view, because you are so structured and clear with the way you can express and advise. And it's true. And there's things that I can look back and go, oh, intuitively I did some of that. But yes, there are gaps that I really like having some of the guidelines very clearly spelled out. And I'm going to briefly, so there were 3 little anecdotes that I think to me show the arc of experiences and sort of illustrate some of what you were just saying and how it impacted myself, my family, my kids later on. The first one I'm going to share is that very first move. So I said in my intro, I lived in one suburban home up until I was age 12. And, as far as I knew, I was going to live there until I moved out for college, and I had a younger brother who was 4. I had an older sister who was 9 years older. So by the time we moved, she was a brand new adult and didn't come with us. So she stayed in that town. And really for her, it was a loss. Like her family moved away. And, of course, she had a boyfriend and didn't want to come with us. But she, later realized, wow, that was a shift in my life, and I didn't realize it. I don't think we realized it at the time. It hit me perfectly. I was like you, very excited. I had spent my whole childhood poring over maps and dreaming over geography books, and I knew very early on I just didn't belong in this community. Good as these people were, they weren't my people. And so even though it was a chaotic move in a way, because it was through a very ugly divorce and we were hurting financially and just all sorts of things coming to a head, it was also for me personally extremely exciting because, and I think this had to do with being a girl, my mom was a role model to me. She owned a small business herself so that she could work from home. And she explained to me, I was old enough at 12 for her to explain, the only law school we're going to go through a few years of hard times financially. I have a plan. we will be moving to the law school. I've got a magnet school for you. You're going, I could be communicated with. I could hold in my head, okay, this is going to be a period of time, and then, we'll rise again. And it was inspiring to me because it was something that I'm very much a proponent of, is taking ownership of your own life path. I mean, life's always going to throw you surprises, but as much as you can, having skills and flexibility to care for your own life. So for me, that was very inspiring to see someone say, all right, this is a temporary hardship. We've got a plan. We're going to make sure your life is good where we're going, even if your immediate surroundings are not familiar to you, and you'll be good. My younger brother, on the other hand, he was just kind of past that cutoff where he was still young enough. He couldn't quite hold in his head that it's going to be rough, it's going to be dark, and then it's going to get lighter. And he loved our hometown. He was captain of his soccer team. He had the same group of 12 boys that they had played soccer together since he could barely walk. He loved it. He was Mr. Popular at school. He was just in his element in that small town. And so the combination of those two things, really, it took him years. I don't think he ever really was happy about that move. And in fact, as soon as he was an adult, he moved back to that hometown. So, and lives there still. So he travels some, but clearly he wanted that. So that's anecdote number one. And sorry, I opened the door for the dog. Sorry. Anecdote number two is sort of an interim where we had, this is with my, so we have an older boy who is almost 30 now, who was raised traditionally, and then decided on his own accord to go off to Montreal because he didn't want to stay in his small, Northern California upbringing. Then we have a middle two set of kids who now are teenagers, and you met them on another show, Jane and Lainey. The first few years that we traveled with them, they were quite young, and so it really wasn't too much of an issue when we got into it. They were just happy as long as mom and dad were there. And they made friends at that age very easily, so it really wasn't that big of a deal. But we didn't know yet about the homeschooling community. There really wasn't a social media community yet, at least not that we were a part of. And so I remember one day that my son Aaron, I was putting him to bed, and of course that's always when they come up with those philosophical questions that just stall bedtime, right? So I'm putting him into bed. He says, Mom, and at this point we had lived in maybe 5 different places, usually for about 6 months. For work, we were business consultants, so we would take a contract for 6 months or a year. So he had moved a couple of different times and always seemed very cheerful and made good friends. But he's at bedtime, he's kind of tired, and he goes, Mom, are we going to move again? And of course, as a mom, this fear strikes into your heart, like, oh no, should I start saving for therapy now? Did I ruin their lives? What have I done? And I just kind of said, well, what an interesting question. I mean, why are you asking? And he goes, oh, I hope so. I love moving. And it just reminded me, oh, it can be so different, even for, boys, even for boys that have had similar experiences. So that was my second anecdote. And then my third is sort of on the other end of the spectrum, where now our youngest, who is, now she's 6, but she's been traveling her whole life. She was born after we had already started. And I was thinking about it, only as a baby did she ever live anywhere for more than 6 months at a time. Most of her life has been spent moving about every 3 weeks, whether in an RV with her familiar belongings or with Airbnbs or, carry-on only, flying from country to country. And this year is the first time that we that we chose to have a home base in one city so that we could tend to our business. And so My husband is more in this home base, and we're here most of the time. And then I'm the one taking more solo trips. So our travel dynamic has really changed this year, where it's me taking trips, but we're not traveling as a whole family most of the time. And it's an experience where instead of moving every 3 weeks, she has toys. She has a bed, and that's her bed. And we bought a rug, and that's the first time she's ever known you could do that. She's not, and so we just did take a trip this last week, and she couldn't quite, I saw she's always been the best traveler. She has some sensory processing concerns, but she's a sensory seeker. And so travel for her, that fast-paced form of life, has been absolutely an incredible match for her. And I'm seeing now, it's interesting, this was the very first time that I announced, we're going to go on a trip. And I ever got anything except, absolute joy. She was like, okay, are we gonna come back to this house? She couldn't grasp the idea that people take vacations and then go back to the same place. And that was a real eye-opener for me. And so I kind of have to laugh when people are like, kids need stability, and they do. I mean, there's other ways to provide the stability. I'm not saying they don't need the stability, but just as an anecdote, kids, and I know I'm not the only one of the world schooling families that have added to their families on the move, and they are a whole new generation of just global nomads and wireless nomads. And so technology, when I try to identify what was the difference between my brother and me in 1980 and my kids now, and the kids in the middle, it's really, a lot of it is the connectivity as you have the mobility, because, especially as an 8-year-old boy, when my brother's relationships were based on doing things together, doing soccer together, even if there had been the technology, those friendships would not have sustained, especially not at that young age. And especially as boys that aren't going to chat on the phone, or weren't, those particular boys anyway, compared to my middle two kids, who I could see even with them being just 2 years apart, there were a few years where the older tween and teen, her friends could stay connected as we moved around. And again, my son had a bit of a harder time because his relationships were real world. They went fishing together. They went hiking together. They played soccer together. They did things together, or they sat and played video games in the same room together. And that online gaming hadn't exploded, until, when he was that young. Now that they're both teens and they can stay 100% connected. I mean, ironically, even when we're in the same city, they see their friends online more than they see them in person. So, they are 100% wired up now. They are practically living in the cloud. I mean, they enjoy everywhere we go. They love the real world, but it makes zero difference to them whether their laptop is sitting, they're playing Minecraft, they're playing Terrarium, they're playing all these games. Well, Minecraft is the same world whether they're in Turkey or whether they're in Mexico or whether they're in suburban USA. So they're almost living in these cloud worlds, which makes mobility moving forward to me extremely interesting. And I think it's going to continue shifting as this next generation of kids rise up and technology advances even further.
It's so encouraging, I think, after hearing Jen speak and Jane speak as well about how I think the current generation of parents have more of an understanding about mobility and how to help their kids with the shift. And especially Jane, it was really inspiring to hear about all these educational tools that are available now. Because when I was moving, I know TCK as a term, it was coined a fair bit of time ago, but I think it wasn't really accessible, and these different ways of learning about how to adjust when you moved, it certainly wasn't available to me. And interestingly, at TCK Town, we just finished an entire edition where moving was the topic, and we published articles about it all through July, and that our entire generation of writers that wrote for that article, none of our parents helped us manage the moves at all. And you can see that in the writing. It's every story is about each writer's own journey and how they had to find their own tools. And I'm actually quite encouraged, again, after hearing Jane speak, that thankfully, like, one of the ethos behind TCK Town is like, dig deep, look at how you felt about it, and then think about why you felt that way. So like, thankfully, our brand guidelines are sort of helping the writers as well, so analyze it in maybe a way we couldn't with our families when we were younger. So it's good to see that. I think like future TCKs will maybe have more support than TCKs like myself and our writers did with mobility.
Yeah, this is fascinating. I'm sorry, Jane, go ahead. I know you wanted to respond to that. Go ahead. And I'll pop in after.
Sorry, Lainey. Yes, I think it is a really exciting time, Alba. We know so much more than we ever have before, but it is a challenge to get the information out there. And when Jen was talking about the technology aspect and how that had added a whole new element to mobility, I was reminded of that because TCKs now, the current generation of TCKs, can be fully connected, and there are so many online forums now for them to share their stories and share their journeys, and that's why your TCK Town is such an important element in that. One of the interesting things about the technology, Jen, to your point earlier, was something that I find a lot in students that I work with is the importance of managing even the technology use as well, because moving to a new location, I've seen so many students who are so desperate to maintain contact with the friends that they have left behind, and so they're online at all hours of the day and night. But what that means is that they cannot engage and build friendships with people where they are, and so their new location becomes a really miserable experience for them because they're not prepared to engage. And there's this whole thought process, particularly amongst girls, that they cannot be friends with new people because it means they're being disloyal to their old friends. And so I do a lot of work with children about that. So technology is so good, but even technology needs to be managed as well.
I do agree with that. I think I feel that quite a lot just working with TCK Town. I wish there was a way to get the support out further and help people more than what we're doing. Like, we're only a magazine. We only publish certain articles, a certain number of articles each week. I wish we could do more, because we do get messages all the time, and a lot of those messages are, oh, I didn't know I was a TCK till I read your article, and now I get it. And I think you're right. I think even though the tools are available, they're not available to as many people as they could be, and that's probably a challenge that people in our space who are trying to reach out to people and help them have to face and try and overcome.
And I'm hoping that shows like this bridge that gap or help to bridge that gap. And we're going to take a short break. We'll come back and continue the conversation about community and connectedness and learning. So we'll be back in just a few minutes.
Have you ever dreamt of traveling the world, learning how to behave in different cultures, adapting to many different lifestyles, and understanding how different parts of the world work? Well, in most cases, this is what a TCK, in other words, a third culture kid, is used to doing. My name is Amandine. In my short 15 years of life, I've moved 7 times all over Europe and Asia. For most, home is where you live, but for me, home is a feeling rather than a place. Born in England and raised in France by a Belgian mother and a French father, there was no doubt that I would spend my childhood in my hometown in France, Les Rousses. That was until I was told we were moving to Tokyo for my father's job. And here I was, my 6-year-old self, being taught that Japan was outside of France, in a different country, a different continent in fact. I was excited, but I wasn't at all realizing what was about to happen to me. Growing up in Asia made it almost impossible for me to answer the question, where are you from? Do I match my mother's Belgian nationality or my father's French roots? Am I from where I was born in England? Perhaps I'm Japanese or maybe even Singaporean. Even better, maybe this meant I could choose. But how do I come to terms with the fact that I don't only come from one place? I soon realized that France had become strictly a label, not a nationality. Making friends wasn't always easy, but being surrounded with kids that were living similar expat lives meant I became used to the idea of saying goodbye and hello again. Whenever I went back to France to visit my family on holidays, I often felt out of place. While my family members were satisfied with talking about politics, movies, and important family news, I found myself being restricted to talk about my recent holidays in Cambodia, my ability to speak Chinese, or the triathlons I did in Bintan every year. As a child, I didn't understand how talking about things that seemed completely normal to me could vex others. I repeatedly found myself judging everyone who couldn't relate to me. What I didn't realize was that I was ignorant to the lifestyle my family was living. I almost became selfish because I believed my life was the best and I couldn't understand anyone who thought otherwise. Moving to Dresden has been an amazing roller coaster of emotions. Now that I'm here, I've come to the realization that home for me isn't permanent, and I'm okay with that. Being a third culture kid and living an expat life has taught me so much about myself and has definitely shaped me into who I am today. I am forever going to be thankful for all the things my unique lifestyle has brought me to experience.
So we do hope that you enjoyed the video that we played during that break, but we want to continue the conversation. Actually, Jane, I'm just going to go ahead and give you back the floor. I know you wanted to respond to what Ava was saying before that, so the floor is yours.
Yes, one of the things that Ava said was how many people come to her at TCK Town and have had this aha moment. For the first time, they suddenly have an explanation for why they are feeling the way they are, their cultural identity and so on. And it reminded me of perhaps the resource that began this whole journey into getting the TCK label out there, and I'm beginning to really understand who these children are and how we can really support them. And it's a book some of you might be familiar with called Third Culture Kids, Growing Up Among Worlds by David Pollock and Ruth Van Renken. This is often referred to as the Bible in global mobility. And the reason for that is because so many people, as they've done with Ava's TCK Town, have read it and gone, aha, it's been like a real epiphany moment and an enlightenment, really, where they've suddenly realized, oh, this is me, and this explains so much. And there's another really great resource that I would highly recommend, and it's a new one just written this year, and it's this one here, and it's called Misunderstood. growing up global or growing up overseas in the 21st century. And, at the beginning of the show, we were talking about how the TCK term is perhaps a little bit limiting. This book delves into all the different types of globally mobile children and their experiences, and it backs it up with the research, and it's quite a fascinating book. So it's kind of like a modern take on the third culture kids, so I'd recommend both of those.
That's a great resource. I also wanted to follow up a little bit on what you were saying earlier about finding the right balance with how do you maintain connections as you are mobile, and how do you get out in the real world and experience where you are and make, differing types of friendships, whether they're going to be brief friendships because of a shared activity or because perhaps those people aren't online as much. Or if they're going to be lifelong friendships. But either way, for what I wanted to start with is saying that we educate our kids. So our kids not only game online and use, my daughter will use social media a little bit more, and the online chatting and texting. They both do, really, to stay connected. My son more uses the gaming. So where my, younger brother in that generation might have been out on a soccer field, my son now is building whatever they're building in Minecraft. So we've got the gaming online, and it's really been beautiful to see them add new friends ever we go into this core group of friends that are their gaming friends. So they're making friends for their other friends that may not even travel. They're being exposed to these global kids that my kids are, adding to the group. And that's been a really fascinating thing. We also educate quite a bit online. So we're life learners. We go out a lot. We go to a lot of museums. We like to be out in nature. We like to experience deeply everywhere we go, even if we're there briefly. But we also do a lot of online gamified learning and sort of larger multi-courses on the internet. That, for me, has shifted the dynamic a little bit of how we think about moving, and also how the kids need to process it, or really don't anymore need to process it the way that they used to. And that's because in these courses, they're meeting kids already from around the world, just as I, adminning the World Schoolers group and participating in the World Schoolers group, already have friends I just haven't met yet in person. And so that's really shifted it from this sort of, not scarcity mentality, but this sort of feeling like you're leaving, and you still are, and that still needs to be processed, but it also has this sort of pull toward the future, because you're going to go and meet these people. There's an excitement that you're going to go and meet these people in person. And we have a Minecraft subgroup for the World Schoolers group, and these kids are meeting each other and asking each other, what country are you in now? Where are you today? How old are you? Where have you been? What do you, and it's great. I mean, the one thing that struck me this week is I'm seeing kids, especially third culture kids, ask each other, not where do you live, but where are you based, or where are you now? And it's great. So that's my point, is we are online a lot for gaming. We're online a lot for education, how that's shifted how we think about travel, because there's an abundance to it now. We know there's not just a place we get to visit, but there's people we're going to get to visit wherever we go. The third reason we're online a lot is because we work online. What we do for a living is teach people how to build online businesses. So, including our kids, as entrepreneurs ourselves, it's a big deal for us to teach our children to create little online businesses. We've opened nonprofits and things like that with them as young as 7 years old. So you're right, Jane, that between learning online, gaming online, and working online, there's a lot of time online. And so I just wanted to briefly address your point of how to find that balance and just share a few of the things, a few of the tricks that we've found, even when we're coming in and out of communities every 3 weeks, that we've formed lifelong friendships, and some not lifelong, some just fun in the moment, relationships as well. But one thing I do is 2 of the years that we traveled, we were in an RV. And so I made sure that we would be seeing the same families as we moved around. So I joined a membership resort, like a family of resorts. They have about 80 resorts all around the country. And I knew, and once you're a member, you can use any of the resorts. And I knew that we would then see the same families here and there. So everywhere we ended up going, it might not be the same set of friends. It would always be an ever-changing mix, but they knew at least 5 to 10 other kids everywhere we were, anywhere in the country. And often we were caravanning together with 30 families, snowbirding slowly up one coast and then down. So even though we're moving so rapidly, they had a really strong community, and it was a gated resort. It was almost reminds me of that old funky in Dirty Dancing, like the 1950s. Like there were shuffleball courts, and they had foxtrot at noon, and there was a pool and a tennis courts, and it was that kind of safe, almost 1950s feel. And all the parents knew each other. The speed limit was 5 miles an hour, so the kids could just be out. The sun came up, the kids went out, they were fishing, they were boating, they were hiking, they were just whatever. I'm sure they were gaming too. And so there's a lot of good relationships created there. But when we were in a different phase of travel, which was that we knew we were coming in and out of communities for about 6 months to a year at a time, we've done different things. Depending on how strong the homeschool community is and extracurricular type of activity community is in that town, we've had different strategies. So there have been times that we've been able to plug into amazing co-ops. So right now here in Phoenix, Scottsdale, Arizona, I've never seen a co-op this wonderful for us. They're so in line with our learning philosophies. It was like the first day we walked up to the co-op, it was like, oh, my people, we will love each other for life. We have a lot in common. And again, that's why immediately those kids could just seamlessly join the group of gamers and the group of, social conversation that they've been having all along. When we've had experiences where there wasn't a strong homeschool community, I would get them deeply involved in an activity. We're passion-driven learners. So in addition to the online courses that they take, we really try to seek out, even if it's not a co-op, some classes here in town that they can just dive into, an activity, whether it's going to be theater or skiing or, and they can really just deep dive into that and make some friends that they know are going to have something in common. Another technique that we've used, even if we're in an absolutely foreign place, is to serve, to volunteer, because by doing that, number one, you're going to pretty much be guaranteed that you're going to meet good people if you're volunteering. You also know that they're going to be interested in the same sort of causes as you if you're choosing a cause that you're passionate about. So, yeah. And it's also a way to show that community that you're there, especially if you do it in a respectful and almost partnership type of way rather than as a savior type of way where you're coming in to save the community. It's a great way to come in and listen, and even if you're there briefly, to have a deep connection because they know that you've established we're here to help. We're here with respect. Please teach us about this community. Please teach us what your needs are. Show us how we can best serve. And, once you're doing something together, if you're doing a service project together, I just find that doing something is the fastest way to make a really deep connection. So that's one thing. And then as a last resort, we've enrolled them in school on occasion. There's twice we've done charter schools. And one was a self-directed, it was like a garden and animals. So again, it wasn't the type of school where they're just sitting quietly at desks. They were doing things with these kids. They were milking the goat. They were harvesting the eggs, things like that. And we even had another charter that we did that was they were able to get up and move around. They had an exercise room in their classroom. And at any time during the day, anytime they wanted to stand up and go get on the treadmill or get on the exercise bike or move. So again, they were doing things with these kids. And in that particular town, the PTA, the Parent Teacher Association, that was where it's at. That's what you had to do to know all the moms in town. And they were a great group of hardworking volunteers. And so, yeah, those are the things so far that we've done. And then also I would say the final trick is to instill in the kids a sense of responsibility for that and giving them the skills and resources to be able to, now that they're older, start creating their own social groups. And they're very comfortable doing that themselves now. They know how to introduce themselves. They know how to identify within themselves what they're interested in doing once we go to a new town. So once we know we're moving, we look up what ahead of time, who's in that town. I'll go to World Schoolers, the World Schoolers Facebook group. I'll start searching through the archives. Who lives here? Who's been here? I'm shameless. I'll just send them all, you seem really knowledgeable, or I'll just read everything they've written about that town and get a sense of, oh, there's the art studio in town. There's this, thank you. So really crowdsourcing those resources, reaching out to them and preceding community before we get there, reaching out to the homeschool communities before we get there and say, hey, we're going to be new. My kids really want to know anybody. Do you, number one, have recommendations? And then number two, is there someone there that can be our welcome wagon that can just help smooth that transition? Because it's finding that one person that is going to help introduce you, that just, for us anyway, helps smooth it out. So those are the different tricks we found in the different phases of our travels.
Oh, outstanding. And everything that you have just talked about, Jen, exemplifies managing mobility. It is everything all the steps you're talking about are intentional, and all of those steps are leading towards your kids being authentic human beings, but also having authentic experiences in each of those locations as well, and making the most of the incredible opportunity they have to travel the world or travel within a country to be that cultural bridge, between and among worlds. I think you've given some absolute gems of wisdom there. So thank you so much for that. And it all comes back to it's the connection, isn't it? It's about building relationships, because if we can't walk into personal relationships with confidence, it makes life very difficult. So by managing mobility, it really helps us to be able to connect with other human beings on an authentic level. I love what you said at the end there about the power of the network. Oh my goodness, thank goodness. And this is another great example of technology, isn't it? Is using the network. Someone knows someone who has been there or who is living there right now, and just having that someone who can show you even the most basic things, where you can buy a litre of milk, or where something as basic as that, just makes mobility that little bit easier. It's one less obstacle you need to overcome. So absolute gold in what you were saying there, Jen. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can speak to the connection between technology and TCKs. Following on from what you said, Jen, and what you mentioned as well, Jane, TCK Town, we basically solely exist digitally, and we created the magazine again through these networks and through these connections. So it was literally Paul and I reaching out to other friends online mostly, and trying to find other TCKs who wanted to tell this story or tell their story. So it's really fascinating to see that, yeah, we have certain challenges when we arrive in a country that we have to deal with, but in the online space, as a community, we're really using that tool to our advantage to really grow and learn. Yeah, like we conduct most of our activity online. We work across a messaging platform called Slack. We basically do all of our editing and collating and curating of articles on Google Drive. And we have like a weekly Skype meeting on Sunday. There are no boardroom meetings. And with a few of the team members that are in Melbourne, just to try and, maybe I'm being old-fashioned, but just to try and keep another level of connection, we do try and have socials from time to time. Like my disco curtain is from us like having drinks over here for our first birthday party. It's not something I have up all the time. But I think there's a real strength to TCKs using the internet and digital spaces to connect and create things together.
So I want to ask a question. It's a little outside of the realm of mobility. I just finished a conference over the weekend, and I was sharing our experiences about travel and about strategies that we can culturally immerse ourselves and find ways to find the commonalities instead of always looking at the differences. I was wondering if you as a panel could comment a little bit about those as challenges that TCKs may actually encounter as they move to other cultures.
I wonder, just to play the devil's advocate, I wonder if we need to find commonalities, or maybe just talk more about what the differences are and learn more about them. Because I think differences don't necessarily have to polarize people. It could more be a case of, oh, okay, so that's how you do things. This is how I do things. Now that I can see another perspective, I get that there are different ways to approach this one problem. And instead of thinking I'm right and you're wrong, I've just expanded my knowledge a little bit. I think there's definitely a strength in looking for commonalities, and I think we all have them in some shape or form. But just on the flip side, I think there's a lot of positives in just learning more about our differences and speaking about them more openly.
I love that. I completely agree. I don't know. It's such an interesting question. I think that the way that okay, let me collect my thoughts. So because of my upbringing and because knowing early on I was not staying where I was staying, my thinking has always been, okay, then how do I shape my life to get from point A to point B, or point anywhere but point A, and then especially then being in an inner city community that I could see was struggling, and I could see that sometimes what we think are differences are really circumstances. And it's, the people that often were there were not necessarily there by choice. Or they had some extenuating circumstances for the most part of why they were there. So really for me, it's been finding that balance point of you need to have some awareness of how to shape your life. And part of that is learning about all the options out there. And so for me, learning about differences is an opportunity to I'm always sort of meta when I meet people who are with differences, and this is what I try to teach my kids is, it's like you said, Ava, it does not have to be polarizing. It can be an experience. It's not necessarily good or bad that they're different. It's something that you can look at, you can experience, you can determine if that is a good fit for you. Is that something you want to incorporate into your identity, into your method of however you're going to live your life. And the hope for me is that my kids will be these patchwork quilts and take a little bit of the best of whatever, at least for their personal, what they feel is the best for them personally from each little community that we've ever gone to. And that, like I said, that includes up and down the economic spectrum. That includes ethnic differences. That includes geographical differences. I mean, just everywhere, how people do things, evaluate if that's a good fit for you. The challenge to that, though, is because, and I think this comes back to being a TCK kid, is that because you are a patchwork, there is no one place where you can go. I mean, you can't, there is no place now anywhere on the world, not that there is for anyone, but that certainly, you know, suburban Indiana is probably the closest you're going to get to a homogenous type of culture where people tend to share the same faith, share the same economic, you know, if only because of segregation, they're going to share the same experience, the same way of, you know, tradition, the way things are done. Whereas for us, there is nowhere on this planet that we can go now and people are going to do everything how we do, because we have taken from Turkey and that from France and this from Mexico and this from Indiana, and you know, and so I would say that would be our challenge. It's both a blessing and a challenge to be able to go see the differences, appreciate them, sometimes struggle with them because things are done differently. And, you know, that's to me part of the philosophical practice of being a third culture kid is not reacting, you know, to give yourself that space, to not get stuck, to not take it personally, not let ego immediately do that. And then that's something we consciously try to practice in each new location is we're going to see something different. We're going to, you know, how do you do that respectfully? How do you do that in a way that creates a space where they also can do that with you and who you are, you know, like with the gaming kids, some of them haven't traveled at all. And how do you make sure you don't polarize the situation for them? And how do you make sure they don't feel looked down upon because they haven't traveled, so that they can have some oxygen to get to know each other. So I don't know that I have any clear way to wrap that all up, but I'd say, you know, we're patchworks. We try to be intentional. We try not to let our ego, you know, lock us in or get us stuck, that things have to be one way. And we try to consciously, you know, like on Facebook, I don't unfriend hardly anyone on Facebook. I just don't. They can be polar opposite. Almost every friend I have on Facebook, I also have their nemesis as a friend. You know, and I love that. And I almost am stubborn about that. I'm not going to unfriend because I learn. I mean, things that later I find out, oh, that was just me. That was just my ego. I was just stuck. And if I hold this space, I find it magical that people, not only am I getting to see the differences, even when it's challenging and challenges my own beliefs, but everyone I know gets to have a space where they know I'm going to keep it respectful. I'm going to make everybody be on good behavior. But beside that, they can learn slowly. And it's been a magical thing to see over years. And it takes years, not like it happens overnight sometimes, but it takes years. And I see even people that aren't traveling that wouldn't identify as third culture that, you know, I mean, even on hot button issues like LGBTQ, people that were one side of the fence and the other side of the fence and just have slowly interacted, frankly. And so I guess that's the challenge, keeping your ego out and, you know, finding ways to incorporate it into your own life.
Yeah, I think respect is maybe the most important thing in all of this. I mean, whether you're seeing similarities or you're seeing differences, however you choose to see things or you choose to discuss things, I think, yeah, it is important to keep respect at the front. And that's something we're trying to do in the magazine. It's if you're speaking about your own experiences, or even if you're speaking about difficult third culture experiences, no matter how hard it was for you or how difficult it was, like, you have to talk about that with respect, because that just encourages more dialogue and it stops shutting people down from having opinions who might be different from you. So yeah, I agree with you on that point, Jen.
I agree with both of you. I think you have articulated it incredibly well. Jen, one of the things that you mentioned was that I thought was quite interesting was, well, this was my interpretation of what you said, so you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but just the whole concept of understanding who you are and your own cultural identity and what that brings into the conversation. So, and our third culture kids have so many different cultures that they can bring to help form the person that they will become and the cultural identity that they become. And certainly for me as a parent, that was one of the big pluses about us moving overseas and moving to other cultures, was to expand our kids' worldview and to be able to see things from different perspectives and really developing their cultural intelligence, really looking at the variety of cultures and understanding, well, this is the culture that we have come from, this is how we value time, just as an example. The culture that we are moving to, this is how they value time. But then in a conversation you're having with someone, particularly in a location such as Singapore where we were based, it is such a transient community. There's every nationality known to man there, I'm sure. Even having a conversation and coming to that point where you can understand the culture that they're coming from. But it all starts from that place of respect, which you were speaking about, Ava, before. And that's what I love so much about mobility. And people say to me, now that I've repatriated back to Australia, what do you miss most about living overseas? And the answer I give them is that I miss the conversations, because every conversation I had with people when we were living overseas, I would gain a new perspective. They would bring their cultural history and their journey to the conversation, and so I would learn a new perspective, and I loved that so much, and I really do miss that terribly. So that's why it's always so great to get on here for the love of learning, because see, I learn from you all, and I love the different perspectives.
Yeah, I think it's true. I think at least like in the magazine, we tend to look at it as we're the same and we're different, and they're not necessarily mutually exclusive things. And what I've done deliberately in how I curate each edition is we set one theme each month, and then people from across the world interpret the theme as you see fit. And I think this is just a perfect illustration where someone from Pakistan and someone from Australia has the same experience, but then someone else from Pakistan and someone else from Australia will have two completely different ideas about exactly the same thing. So I think, yeah, like it's important to understand that there's a spectrum of how you see things. It's okay. And we just need to be respectful and just talk about things more, and I think things can only improve from better and more conversations.
I don't think I can disagree with that at all. This has been amazing. What do you think that third culture kids bring to the mix that is different in business situations, in perhaps university situations, in civic situations? What do you think that they can bring, and without being exclusive, I'm the exclusive TCK club kid here, but what kind of humility and what is the value that they can bring that can help bridge those strains, those gaps, those places where we don't really connect?
Yeah, it's a good question, because I think it conflict, right? Is my personality based on my third cultural experiences, or is it just my personality? So I mean, I'm sure all of you are well versed with this. Apparently, third culture kids, it's easier for us to hit the ground running. It's easier for us to relate to a wider range of people because we've traveled more and we've been exposed to so many different personalities, and we've learned from an early age how to be compatible with perspectives that are different from our own. So potentially that's something third culture kids can bring into schools, universities, or organizations. But for the sake of having a flip side, I know plenty of third culture kids who are super awkward with that sort of thing. And unfortunately, maybe because they haven't had that support while they've been mobile and while they've been moving, they haven't gained that advantage, and actually the moving has made it difficult for them to fit into new places. So, I mean, my knee-jerk reaction is we can get along really well and communicate and relate to people quite easily, but like, I think it's arguable about how much that's really true, if that makes sense.
I think one of the things with third culture kids is that they have experienced being a minority in most cases. They've been the new kid on the block. They have started from zero base. And so there is an empathy that comes with that. They understand what it is like to be an outsider. And so I think they bring that to any conversation, to their learning, to the workplace, and having that perspective. I think, Jen, you can probably speak more to this, but even from an entrepreneurial perspective, coming from the outside the box, for want of a better word, and looking for new opportunities, I think that's would be one of the key things.
I'll talk. I have a few thoughts about that like I said, from a business perspective. I think third culture kids and just any global citizen or any well-traveled person brings so much to the table. And that's why we're seeing even the highest universities seeking out homeschooled kids and well-traveled kids. Because like you said, they think out of the box. And sometimes it can come down to just logistics. They have had more experiences. So even if they aren't particularly thinking outside of the box, they have a lot more boxes. I mean, they are at a huge advantage because they've experienced more. They just logistically have seen more options. So when you're coming up with solutions, they have experienced. So they don't even have to invent the wheel. They don't have to be that creative. They can relate back to something that solved a problem for them, in the past. And of course, they are familiar with rolling with problems. I mean, quite literally, you're rolling along a cobblestone street, your bag drops a wheel. What do you do? Oh, we've got leftovers and there's no bowls or Tupperware in this house. Well, you give yourself, what did Allison, another world schoolers admin the other day, she just pours all of her leftovers in the middle of some saran wrap, gathers it all up like a little hobo sack, and ties it together, and that's her Tupperware. So, from a business perspective, these guys have weathered more storms. I mean, often they've, and they have, at least at first, parental support as they do it, but they know that is part of life. They haven't had their activities scheduled for them. They haven't had their school, all scheduled. They've had to be in the mud, and so that, and having more experiences, I think, is a big deal. I also think, at least speaking from my own kids, there can just be logistics too. There can be language barriers that kids who have lived in multiple places, they can communicate and they can understand the intricacies of how not to offend someone or how to not get offended, because that is just a phrase that, or maybe, not to generalize too much, but, people from this country tend to be a little bit more blunt. Americans, for example, than people in, other countries tend to have certain ways that we are offending them. So just being aware of those little intricacies in communication make all the difference when you're trying to close a multi-million-dollar deal, and also I think logistically, just math, each time they go to a different culture, if you've only ever lived in one culture, that's 100% of your experience. And then once you've lived in two places, that's 50% of your experience. But by the time you've moved in and out of dozens of communities and cultures, you can have the awareness that you may not have the right answer. There may not be a right answer. It's okay to not have there be a right answer. It's okay to let everyone chime in, and again, getting that ego out of your way and saying, I may be wrong. I have been wrong. I did it wrong in that country. I did it wrong in that country, And so I think two things about that is, one, they're able to listen to people more because they've seen that there are many good ways. There's no one path. And then I think this is an odd benefit, but one that I think in business and in life ends up being very beneficial, which is, I've noticed that when we move quickly, especially when we're not caravanning with the same group of people, when they're moving in and out of different homeschool groups or in and out of different communities or taking a class, that because they know that we're leaving soon, the stakes are lower. So they can play with their personality. They can try out being sport. They can try out being a nerd. They can try, and because, and it's not that they think of people as disposable, but they know that you're not going to get bullied for that for the next 12 years. You're not going to get some nickname that's going to stick with you for the next 12 years. You can take a risk. You can just try out different parts of the personality based on different situations you're in. And then I think in the end, that helps them create a very strong identity, because whoever you are in all of those different situations is who you are. As you move in and out of wildly different situations, you learn not to get pulled about. And so you solidify who you are. And that's a big deal in business and in life. And then being willing to take more risks because you're used to taking risks, and then your envelope of doing so gets pushed beyond someone who hasn't had to do that before. So I think if I had to choose between someone who was, educated at even the top universities or trained at the top corporations but had only been in one traditional setting, or someone who had a third grade education but had moved all over the world and self-started and had a really solid idea of who they were, could move their ego out of the way, build a team, listen to each other, hands down, it's not even a contest. It's going to be the third grader.
I agree with what you're saying. I think, there are a lot of strengths and a lot of benefits that we can bring to the table being third culture kids. And from my experience, I also think it's really wonderful when, as third culture kids, we're in either work or educational settings or even relationships and personal settings where the locals that you're with completely have the capacity to accept you for who you are as well. I think we've all got to work together, as much as we're open-minded and we take risks and we have certain strengths, we also need the support of the local community to really be okay with the fact that, okay, well, this person's a bit different. She sees things this way. She's doing this and that's something I'm not comfortable with. But you know what? I'm going to listen and I'm going to see what this third culture kid is all about. So I definitely think we do bring a lot, but from my point of view, I also feel very grateful for the people in my professional and personal life who haven't been TCKs, who've just had it in their personalities and not necessarily in their international experiences to say, okay, Ava's a bit left of center, but I'm going to listen to what she has to say anyway.
Yeah, and that's so important too. And we're talking conceptually. We're not talking any absolutes about anything. Everybody is an individual. But wow, what an interesting conversation. Before we run out of time, I actually want to go around to each of our panelists and give you the opportunity to share any final thoughts. If somebody's watching this and is seeking support or seeking some sort of community or some sort of way of understanding and managing their mobility as they are traveling from culture to culture or place to place or whatever it may be. What would your final thoughts be for them, your closing remarks? And when you're done with the closing remarks, please do share your projects and websites as well. So I'm going to open it up. Please just take the floor.
Okay, I'll take the floor first, just because I have one more little point as to the challenges in businesses, and then which leads into the message I would give people. I do think that the one downside to be aware of, if you're, at least in my experience, and part of it is personality, of course, and part of it I think depends on how fast you or your kids are used to traveling. But I do think that one downside can be that it can then be difficult to go back to a cubicle, to go back, you're not going to be, it's not going to be as easy to spend your life in a cubicle as it would have been if you had never tasted the world, So that is a downside. Luckily, the world is shifting, and, there's less of that. There's more mobility, but that is one concern. Your kids may not then want to come live back in your little town in wherever and, have a traditional life. And so that's part of what I would say as a business thing, but part of the message I would give to parents. Now, on the plus side, I would say don't worry whatsoever, because in my opinion, who would want a cubicle for their child? And you're giving the kids the world. Not only do you not need to be worried that your children will possibly turn into wonderful people with, many doors open to them, but it's almost inevitable, in my opinion, that will happen, because that's just the nature of this life. And there are so many resources now with online learning, with online gaming, with community building, even working online once they are adults, that the world really is kind of catching up to our bleeding edge lives. And so please don't worry. My third thing I would just say is, as I said before, it's important to have that one person who is, or those many people that are going to help ease your transition, and that you at least know if you get stuck, you can either even if you can't crowdsource, if you don't feel comfortable just throwing it out there because you're a private person or whatnot, find a few people online. And you can find me. My Facebook page is Silver Lining Life. You can always message me through that, or Jen at Silver Lining Life. I absolutely, being an admin for the World Spoilers Group, I'm incredibly passionate about that. I deeply enjoy volunteering and helping people to find ways to help World Schooling work for their family. So if you get stuck, if you get worried, if you're freaking out at 2 a.m. about whether your kid's going to turn out or get into college or whatever your concern is, send me a message. If I can connect you with other people, if I can, I'll talk you down off the wall, or I'll get you connected with people that have the resources that help you feel empowered, because really the research often does bring the anxiety down. So yeah, feel free to connect with me. If I can help, I'm always happy to help.
Brilliant, Jen. So my closing remarks probably follow on quite nicely from what you have just said. We know now that the current generation, Generation Z, that's the generation that our children are now, it's reported that they will have 17 different jobs, 5 different careers, and live in 15 different homes. So the reality is that these kids are companions of change, and they will also be agents of change. So globally mobile kids and domestically mobile kids, the ones we've been talking about today, are ideally positioned in this current world where there is constant change. And so by managing mobility, we are teaching our children to really look at transition as a process. And by helping them transition from one location to another, we are giving them the tools then to transition and deal with change in whatever context, whether it's the business context that Jen was talking about now. So if they take up leadership positions within organisations, if they are entrepreneurs, they will be able to manage change. And let's face it, that is part of part of life now, isn't it? So really by helping our children work through the challenges associated with mobility, we are helping them to actively or proactively engage in the process of transition, which is a vital skill for this century, this 21st century in which we live. So, and that places them in an ideal position to be that cultural bridge that we were talking about, to really understand and be able to relate to people from all different perspectives and all different places around the world. So I work with families to help them transition to new locations, to new environments. And so if you want to get in contact with me, my website is Globally Grounded. On that website, I actually have a whole page of resources. So when Lainey was talking before about any resources that might help you, if this is something that has really triggered thoughts for you or ideas, or you want to know more, there's a whole page there of resources broken up into younger kids, older kids, if you're a counsellor, a teacher, a parent, online tools, whatever. So there's a lot there. Also, if you are concerned about your third culture kid and you think that you might need some one-on-one help for them, there's also an international therapist directory there which you can access, or you can just message me and I can give you specific recommendations. You can also follow me on Facebook on Globally Grounded, Twitter at Globally Grounded, and I think that's about it. And congratulations, because I think our kids are being placed in a position to succeed if we manage their mobility well.
Yeah, I mean, this has been such a great chat. I'm really thrilled to have been a part of this panel with all of you. So thank you, Lainey, for inviting me and allowing me to come on board, and Jen and Jane. It was really interesting hearing about your perspectives, especially from an educational point of view, because I think as an editor-in-chief of a digital magazine, we're looking at it more, I guess, from like a emotional and a literary sense. And I mean, I guess just to address on the challenges and the advice that comes with being mobile and moving a lot, like how we approach it at TCK Town is it's hard and that's okay. And the more you read about it and the more you can be open about what you're going through, and the more you don't judge yourself for what you're going through, maybe the easier it will be to deal with whatever you're facing. So our writers are really very honest. They're very vulnerable about what they're going through. And what we found is either their honesties helped other people, and we do get a lot of responses back saying, thank you for being so truthful about this. That's exactly what happened to me, and I didn't know till you told us. Or what's even better is a lot of people write in their own stories and they say, well, you were brave enough to talk about this, so here's my story. Can you publish it as well? So in terms of how TCK Town can help, please do check our website out. We write on a variety of topics each month. And there are some really great insights from so many different people across the world dealing with really like fundamental things like friendship, family, relationships. We have a food edition, which is really good. We also have a Facebook group as well. If you search TCK Town on Facebook, we're really easy to find. We're on Instagram as well at TCK Town. And if you ever want to get in touch with me, either to publish work or even just to chat, I usually have coffees with a few people who know I'm in Melbourne and just kind of get to talk about the magazine. I'm at editor@tcktown.com.
Well, thank you. Thank you all so much for the really enlightening conversation and closing remarks, and very, very thoughtful sharing of your experiences. So I'm really, really grateful. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for this conversation. Thank you, Nina, who produced this show. She put together this panel. And again, I'm so in awe of the work that you do, Nina. Thank you for everything behind the scenes. And over to Mel and Biggie over at Conscious Consumer Network. Again, we thank you. Thank you for providing this platform for us to broadcast on. And we're grateful to be here. This is over 2 years now. And as I was reading the introduction to the show, 111 shows. Wow, that still blows my mind. Thank you, Mel and Biggie over at Conscious Consumer Network for that opportunity. Finally, I'd like to end every show by saying wherever you are and whatever you do, continue to always do it for the love of learning.
If we want to change the world, we must first change the media. Mainstream media exists for the purposes of indoctrination and manipulation of public perception. The world of free and independent media is growing, and with the upsurge in information now available in the public domain, it has never been easier to access free and independent media. The exploration of this information resulted in an experimental project which would provide a fully supported space for researchers, whistleblowers, and seekers of all kinds to express themselves and educate the world. On the 1st of January 2015, Conscious Consumer Network was launched to the world. Nobody thought we would make it this far, but CCN is the longest running free and independent media network of its kind. CCN is a unique collaboration of hearts and souls, bringing you information from different perspectives to educate and inform. Since we started CCN, we have had only one desire, the pursuit of a free, fair, just, sustainable world, and this has not changed. Having overcome many challenges over the last 2 years, CCN is here to stay, and we've got great things lined up for 2017. Help keep CCN on the air by supporting the 2017 Network Support Fund.